So we're doing an outdoor episode today. We're going to smoke a few slabs of ribs on an offset smoker. And when it comes to offset smokers, sure, you might have gone for one of these real nice fancy ones like you see here, but in all likelihood, you got a piece of shit like this one. Don't worry though, you can still produce great barbecue on one of these things. You just kind of have to know their strengths and weaknesses and limitations. And we'll get back to that here in a few minutes. For now though, let's head on inside and get our ribs ready. So when it comes to ribs, you have a couple of different options. First, you have these loin back ribs, which are also known as baby back ribs. Another option you have are these spare ribs that are just like this, like you see here. And something else you might run into at the supermarket is something called Kansas City style or St. Louis style spare ribs. And all they are is the same cut as these, but they're sort of squared off with the tops and the sides kind of trimmed off a little bit. And that's where you get rib tips from. Some restaurants cut those off before cooking the ribs and some cut them off after cooking the ribs. These though are for a different video. We're gonna be doing baby back ribs here today, so let's go get our rub ready. So for the rub, we're gonna go with a fairly simple one today. Start with 1/4 cup of brown sugar, 2 tablespoons of paprika, and 1 teaspoon each of cayenne pepper, onion powder, garlic powder, and oregano. Give it a mix together and that's it for the rub. I've noticed that a lot of people become disproportionately concerned with rub ingredients, but know that if you don't manage the fire properly or if you overcook the ribs, the rub ingredients aren't going to make up for that. Okay, before we apply the salt or the rub to the ribs, we need to remove the membrane that's attached to the underside of the ribs. To do this, either use the tips of your fingers or a knife to dig underneath and separate it from the bones. And once you have a small bit of it broken free, you can sort of wad it up in your hands and usually get it off in one shot. The reason that we're doing this is that this membrane won't break down during cooking. In fact, it will actually constrict and buckle together, which will squeeze out moisture and toughen the ribs. Okay, once the membranes have been removed, we can move on to seasoning the ribs. So you've probably noticed that I didn't include salt within the rub, and I'm applying the salt and the rub completely separately from each other. And that's because the salt has a completely different effect than the rub ingredients do on the meat. The salt actually digs into the interior of the meat, flavoring the inside and attaching itself to water molecules, which will help the meat retain some of its moisture. Whereas the rub ingredients more just sit on the surface and flavor the surface of the meat. So with these things in mind, a good example to look at here is these ribs being relatively thin, and when you compare them to something like a much larger, thicker pork shoulder, you see that the concentration of salt required for that would be much higher than the concentration for this. And the dry rub concentration being about the surface would be about the same. And if you're interested in reading up more on barbecue and everything that I've covered today and much more, this book called Meathead is a very, very good book to look at, so I strongly recommend it if you're looking for something to read on barbecue. So all we're going for here with the rub is sort of a light dusting. The recipe from earlier is actually enough for 4 or 5 slabs, so don't feel the need to use it all if you're only working with 1 or 2 slabs. The rub will keep pretty much indefinitely in your pantry, so save whatever's left over for your next round of barbecue. And after you're finished up with that, wrap the slabs in plastic wrap and place them over a sheet tray and throw the whole thing into the refrigerator for a little bit. Now I would prefer to have these left in the refrigerator overnight, but I had a little bit of a late start to this, so they're only going to be in here for about an hour, but any bit of time you can devote to this is worth it, even if it is just an hour. So, with that, we'll be back in an hour. Okay, I lied actually. It's only about 30 minutes later because we need to get our fire going for our smoker. And for that, we've got a couple different options. You've got lighter fluid or you have a chimney starter, and I'm gonna go with this today. Okay, to use your chimney starter, all you do is flip it upside down and stuff the bottom portion with crumpled up newspaper. I usually just grab a stack of those ad things you see at the entrance of the grocery store because those are free. And when doing this, there's sort of a happy medium between not using enough to light the coals and overloading it to where it has a hard time catching fire. You'll figure it out after a few times. Then all you do is fill the top side with briquettes or lump coal. Look at this big old sumbitch. I'm aware lump coal has some irregular pieces, but goddamn. Light the newspaper and after about 30 minutes the coals will be lit and we can empty the whole thing into the side box of the smoker. If you are using briquettes, they usually light faster than lump coal, so keep an eye on them and make sure you open the side door all the way. The vents alone won't provide enough airflow to maintain the temperature we need for this. I usually prop the door open to make sure it stays open, and then we're going to toss a log about this size on top of the coals and leave the lid open to maximize its airflow so it gets lit properly. We also have a good chance here to clean the grates off because we always want to start with a clean grill. And while this is heating up, let's go over some of the strengths and weaknesses of this thing and how we're going to approach this whole thing. Basically, these things are built incredibly cheap and flimsy, so this side is a lot hotter than this side, and it's very hard to manage consistent temperatures with these things, unlike the ones you saw earlier, which are built solid and are weigh like 1 billion pounds. So basically trying to get this thing to cook all the way through on this thing is really difficult to do. So we're basically gonna start it on this thing, we're gonna burn through about 4 or 5 of these, and then we're gonna finish it in the oven. And don't worry, like you see here, it's gonna have a lot of smoke flavor and a very good smoke ring out of this. So stick around and you're gonna see what we're gonna end up with. Okay, the wood has caught fire, so at this point it's as hot as it's gonna get, so go ahead and close the lid and we can take our ribs out of the refrigerator and place them into the smoker. I usually try to scrunch them onto the center opposite side of the firebox because the closer you get, it gets significantly hotter. And remember, this stage is about infusing smoke flavor. The cooking will be done for the most part in the oven. Go ahead and close the lid and open the top vent all the way, and let's take a look at the smoke. What you want to see here is transparent smoke that you can barely see. It shouldn't be thick, billowing white smoke because that can impart off flavors into the food. Another thing I'm going to do here is place my next few logs on top of the firebox, which will help them dry out and burn cleanly. And once the first log has nearly burned through all the way, go ahead and place another log into the side box and leave the lid open until it becomes fully lit and catches fire. Then close the lid and repeat this a few times until you've burned through 4 or 5 logs, and on the last one, go inside and preheat your oven to 250 degrees. Okay, now that we've burned through several logs and we have a good amount of smoke infused into the ribs, we can take them off the smoker and finish them up in the oven. You can try to cook them all the way on one of these cheap smokers, but I'm telling you it's a pain in the ass, and this is a much better method for doing this. Okay, so we're done with the smoker portion of the recipe, and these now have to go into the oven. It's set at 250 degrees, and this is gonna take about 2.5 to 3 hours. So let's go ahead and get them in here, and we'll check back in a little bit. So while the ribs are in the oven, I want to quickly go over the concept of what people in the barbecue community know as blue smoke and white smoke. And this will address why I manage the fire the way that I do. So in short, white smoke is bad and blue smoke is good. And white smoke is that thick, billowing smoke that you see, and it can impart bitter off flavors onto whatever you're cooking. You get that by restricting the airflow and smothering the fire and not letting it get lit properly. And when you first start out and lighting a piece of wood, it's all going to produce a bit of white smoke, which is why I left the lid open while they were getting lit until they caught fire completely and they were as hot as they were going to be, and that's when I closed the lid. Now, blue smoke, on the other hand, is much more clean and clear and much less visible like you saw a minute ago. And you get that by maximizing airflow, which is why I opened the side vent completely and left it open the entire time. This is burning much hotter. I allowed the wood chunks to get fully on fire before closing the lid, and this will produce the more desired smoke flavor that you want. So this shows that even if you do have a cheap, flimsy smoker that won't distribute heat very well, you can still produce very good smoke flavor with it. I just wouldn't rely on these for long cooking sessions. If you have something that cooks shorter, like chicken wings or something like that, you can probably fully cook those on there. But something like ribs, where they need to maintain a temperature for a very long period of time, it's best to kind of split that up and get the smoke flavor there and then finish it in the oven where you can maintain a consistent temperature. So these have been in the oven now for about 2 hours and 45 minutes. So let's take a look at them and see what they look like. Okay, so there are a few different methods when testing for doneness. One is to grab a bone and wiggle it, and it's difficult to explain, but it shouldn't feel tight and it should feel slightly loosened from the meat. Another method is to pick up a slab slightly and bend it, and you should see the meat separating from itself, indicating that the connective tissue has been tenderized. You can see the slight tear there, so these are done. Now we have an optional step here of whether to sauce them or not. Some people like them dry, some people like them sauced. And as far as barbecue sauce goes, I don't usually make my own barbecue sauce. I might do that in another video down the road, but I live in Kansas City and we actually have a shitload of options here for really good barbecue sauce. So I'm gonna use a couple of bottled sauces from around here. One of the sauces I'm gonna use is Joe's barbecue sauce, and I'm gonna use LC's on another slab of the ribs. So that's what we're going with. Okay, to sauce the ribs up, this part's pretty simple. I'm going to flip them over and start with the bottom side. Spoon or brush a layer of sauce onto them and place them under a broiler set to the low setting, and it should take about 4 or 5 minutes on each side to glaze up the ribs. Be careful not to leave them in too long because the broiler, even set to the low setting, can be pretty intense and can burn the sauce because most barbecue sauces have a fairly high sugar content. It can even dry out and toughen up the surface of the ribs, so again, be careful with this part. Another good way of doing this is if you have a propane grill, go ahead and fire it up, and you can do this on there, but be careful and stay with it the whole time because it can burn very easily. So the moral of the story here, regardless of the method, is to keep a close eye on the ribs, and if you do, you'll be rewarded with delicious barbecue ribs. So let's cut into these things and see what it all looks like. So what you're looking for is not for the meat to fall off the bone here. What you're actually looking for is to separate and pull away from the bone without much of a struggle, and there shouldn't be any remnants of meat left on the bone. So you should just be able to take it like this and just kind of peel it away, and as you can see, we have a clean bone underneath. That wasn't a very good shot, but how about that? Why not eat a little bit of it now too? Oh, damn. Holy shit.